let's dial back to when you first used OKRs, which was at Google, of course, and maybe set the stage for us. What were you doing and leading at Google, and how did you get acquainted with the technique?
Yeah, it's, having been a McKinsey partner for a really long time, you would have thought, OKRs were in my blood, but I don't think I really understood how to use them as an operator until I was at Google. And that's really where I caught the fire, and it's kind of never turned back. So when I first joined the company, I was leading global operations, and then I was president of the Americas, which is essentially all the commercial operations in North and South America. And, it was such an amazing gift. When I was running global operations, of course, this huge sprawling company across all these geographies, and it's so complicated to drive alignment across that complexity. And at the time, the company was only 17 billion. I know it's kind of hard to imagine now, given the scale of it. We'd never actually had a business plan. The only way we actually ran ourselves was by doing these rigorous goal setting processes, because everything was changing so fast. If you didn't have this constant quarterly review, you would actually kind of lose control of things. So it was very contrarian to anything I'd ever done before. And there were two big issues, right? As you can imagine in any role like that, and ensuring priorities and resources are aligned across the efforts. But as in many tech companies, that alignment between engineering to product to commercialization, and making sure that everybody really understands, right, the pacing and how things are happening. We also spent a lot of time thinking about aligning dedicated teams to new efforts. We use that framework. I think a lot of people have heard 70, 20, 10. So 70% on the things that are really driving results in the next year, 20% on those things that are really driving results over the next 2 years, and 10% on those things that are really going to become significant 3 years from now. And how do you actually really understand, not just say, I'm going to work on something, but how are you optimizing resources to the opportunity? And then last was balancing a lot of complexity across markets. For all of you who work in global organizations, you have markets of totally different sizes, product stages, and needs. And, I actually still remember, a bunch of my country managers are really complaining, and we did this analysis and we on a matrix across functions, products, and countries. And we found that the average country manager had literally 50 different trackers they were entering data into. And so it was such a good exercise, because, you cascaded all this stuff, and then you forget, global company, when the functions are coming at people, and then, sometimes they had more trackers developed than they actually had people. And so it really forced us to back up and say, wait a second, like, what are we really asking people to do, and what's really relevant, at different levels across different areas? And so I just think this OKR process, and actually having to clear that out, would surface like all these ways in which you could create incredible inefficiency. When I was leading the Americas, a whole different set of problems, right? We were over 50% of the revenue of the company, and we were growing 20% or more a year. So just imagine at that scale, going from 25 to over $50 billion, we had to find over $10 billion a year in new revenue. And so that was really complex. Like, how do you keep people constantly understanding what great is? Because things that were a great idea when we were smaller, $100 million idea, then it became 500 million ideas. And I was like, don't show up in my office without $1 billion idea, because you had to keep backing up and figuring out, like, was this really scalable, and re-looking at everything you were doing and how you were doing it. I think the other big piece is when you are at the forefront of launching new products, and you're also trying to drive this kind of scale, what a great launch looked like 3 years ago is not a great launch 3 years later, because you have to actually think about, for it to become material, you really, really, really have to set different kinds of goals to ensure people can do that. So it's been incredibly helpful in all these different stages and ways.
Quite interesting. And obviously the idea of you have to add $10 billion in new revenue is no small trick. That's also amazing acceleration, in particular, it's acceleration at scale. In particular, on accelerating or raising the velocity of the organization, how did OKRs play into that?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I think until you live it, it's hard to imagine how this becomes like all about creating velocity. I think a lot of people think about, you said goals and objectives, you do that in the plan, and then you kind of check back. It's sort of like your measuring stick. But when you're actually using them right, it becomes a galvanizing moment at a couple of levels. At a strategic level, it's about debating as a leadership team, like the tough choices about the metrics that will anchor velocity in your business to the next level. So we would literally spend like a day or two sometimes picking that North Star metric. I think one of my favorite stories, because I think it's so easy to like all of us grasp because we all use YouTube. But I remember like at least maybe a 1 or a 2 day session where we debated, was in the early stages of YouTube and building it out. Our vision was to become, right, the future of television. And this was the whole new way to unlock democratization and do all this. But we had to make conscious choices at each wave of development, what was most important. And then everything cascaded from there. So we had this huge debate about, was the most important priority minutes per session or total minutes watched, just total number of people on the platform. And for any of you that are engineers or marketers, you can think that has totally different implications for the organization. If you're focusing on minutes per session, you're really trying to understand needs and like, what's that next video that person's going to watch? And you have all kinds of different priorities. Then if you're actually trying to get as many as people as possible to watch as many things as possible, like that is a completely different mindset. And so those kinds of debates became galvanizing in the company and making sure everyone was aligned. I think at the operational level, OKRs drive velocity because you have your weekly and quarterly reviews all focused on those metrics that deliver velocity against ambition and what everybody's piece is in that. And it forces you to say, what are those drivers that lead up to that North Star metric? So if you take that YouTube example, right, you can imagine how everybody then is laddered in that product organization, in that marketing organization to accomplish that velocity. And what's awesome is then you can celebrate what's going great. You're also identifying areas that might be slowing you down or out of sync very quickly. And so every meeting is not about keeping score. It's about saying, how fast are we leaning into the future? And if we have any issues, are we fixing them fast? And if there's something that we forgot that's slowing us down, we can actually, learn on the fly and adjust. And I think that just really changes the mindset of the organization.
Yep. The contrast you draw between using it as a measuring stick, which has a little punitive overtone, I think it's got a gotcha construct to it, is so different than the construct of, wait, how are we raising velocity, right? And how are we removing drag? It's quite interesting. In a lot of large organizations, there's such a deeply embedded habit of the gotcha and the inspection. And it's almost like they've forgotten that, wait, what we're really here for is how fast can we go, right? How quickly can we create more value? Why do you think that is? Why do we get stuck in the old mindset?
It's so interesting, because when you're at Google, like you just become part of this. It's just the breathing. And then when I decided to set out and become a CEO in other places, it was, you walk into meetings and you see the difference in energy, right? It's, I think if you're in one of those companies that hasn't bit the bullet on this yet, I mean, your life probably feels, I don't know, this would be my exactly what I felt like in every organization I've come into that didn't have this. Like meetings feel like functional readouts. You walk into a meeting and everybody just sort of says their stuff, but there's not really common engagement. I mean, you have a lot of heated debates, especially in operating meetings when something isn't going right. There's all this debate about the numbers of the trends. Do we have the right data? Different people in the organization have competing fact bases. And it's like you don't have one version of the truth. Then there's lots of meetings before the meeting. Like that to me is like the biggest symptom. You have to be 2 meetings, and a lot of people blame that on the senior people. Yeah, sometimes that's true, but a lot of it's because the senior people didn't make the hard choices. So everybody knows, right? You're in meetings, and instead of making decisions right there's always a call. Every meeting has a call for another follow-up review or a committee to debate the issues, right? Or you have this feeling that all the decisions get kicked upstairs, right? Even low-level stuff has to go all the way to CEO, and then I think you see it in like employee surveys. If you have signals like low empowerment scores or trust in leadership team or clarity on the strategy, like hugely a symptom, like that you're not, able to set these goals and cascade them properly so that everybody actually knows how to lean into the future. And in my experience, this is not just something that works in tech, right? I used it to turn on Mattel. I used it at Ancestry to reset the company. I'm using it now in running a new company. But it takes like 2 to 3 months to get that rhythm going. But once you have it, like that feeling of togetherness, the productivity of meetings, it's like game changing. You're confident when you see opportunity to pour gas on those hockey sticks because everybody knows what you're focused on. When things aren't going quite right, you're proactive about reallocating resources, and people don't actually feel negative about that. They realize it's their obligation to raise their hand and say, I need help, or raise their hand and say, hey, we should reallocate to this until I figure this problem out. And I think my best piece is like you celebrate more, because when you understand all the pieces on the way to the journey, you find more reasons to say, oh my gosh, like this is like better than last quarter, last month, and so I think it gets everybody to feel that sense of velocity. And I don't know, I think it's really game changing.
Yeah, the momentum is completely different. You actually can feel momentum itself. Yeah.
Well, you're creating it and everyone feels part of it, like from the bottom up. It's not just a bunch of senior people that are pulling everybody up.
Right, or pushing them. Yeah. So at Google, it's native language, right? Everyone sort of speaks it from the time they're born. But at Ancestry, right, when you took the practice there, it wasn't a habit they had. Talk a little bit about just sort of the learning journey, the adapting to a different way of, I'll say, coalescing on the strategy itself. How was that?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think about that experience, and I'll actually take it from the beginning with a bit of a context setting, because I think everybody always thinks when things are messy or kind of busy, like, oh, I shouldn't do that later. But I found the total opposite. Like Ancestry is an amazing company and brand, but even the most successful companies have blind spots. So like the 2 to 3 years right before I started, it was that DNA craze, right? You guys saw those ads, they were everywhere. The business was gangbusters on selling DNA kits, but actually the core business is subscriptions, is people coming in, right, and taking a subscription and going on a journey. But that huge bonanza in kit sales was like free acquisition into that engine, as well as the discovery engine of itself. But then all of a sudden the music stopped, of course, just for me. Golden State Killer happened 1 week before I became the CEO, and kit sales dropped in half. So as you can imagine, like that's your entire acquisition engine, and all of a sudden it's gone in half. And so all of a sudden we had to move fast. And, there was a bit of confusion, right? A few layers down, because in addition to the fact that there was this kids craze, we had to hire a lot of people to deal with that. So there were a lot of new leaders, like at the senior level and then one down. And so the biggest thing when we had to pivot was people had always relied on these personal relationships to just like run down the hall and fix stuff. And all of a sudden those relationships weren't there because there were so many new people and so many people. So, and after 2 weeks on the job, I realized like 30% of people's time was wasted because there was not alignment on like what we were doing, how we were doing it. And so we did a total reboot, with OKRs at the core. We started first and said, okay, that's what happened, right? Things change in business. That was like a great bonanza. Now we'll create a new bonanza. But like, what is that new bonanza? And what are those metrics that matter? What's the one version of the truth? Because you can imagine at that point, everybody's hitting the panic button. And that was our biggest risk, was that there were 5 versions of every data set. And I was like, okay, team, we're spending so much time just trying to agree on what's the data. We're going to agree on the metrics that matter. Who owns those metrics? Our meeting cadences are going to be all aligned around the decisions that we own to change our own future. And also, we're going to change how we show up in meetings. We all own that set of numbers and come to the meeting with solution, not to have another meeting. And that whole concept, right, really, is a game changer. And, it took us 3 to 6 months to get into it. And we had to adjust it a few times, as we learned. But then like the whole organization was like a different place, right? We knew what our North Star metric was. It was net subscriber growth and active discovery rate. The year before it was how many kit sales could you do? And that was a huge pivot, but then everybody lined their efforts up against it, and it created so much energy, and it enabled us to really, transition really successfully out of what otherwise could have been, a little bit scary.
I love this story. One of the things I hear a lot is, well, we can't start OKRs yet because we don't have clean data. And the presumption is, right, if we just had all the data right, then it would be really simple. But you point out, well, let's start with what measures even matter.
Yeah.
And start there. And it's a little bit interesting, right, that you could defer thinking about what we should even measure, but you would be in pursuit of all the measures in the universe, of all the things in the universe, right, which certainly do not all matter in the same way.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's like when you're growing gangbusters, it's really important because you have to keep really thinking about this escalation challenge, right? When you're in a turnaround, you need even more focus and alignment because everyone's nervous. So they need to see progress being made. And so really helping to get everyone zeroed in on like the story of the future and giving them the confidence and showing them like progress is being made in small and big ways. And then when you're a small company, right, you don't have a lot of resources. So if you don't have everybody aligned, you're just burning time and money, right? Which is exactly what you don't want to do, especially in today's investor market. And so, I think people always find reasons not to do it. But when you really think logically about what you need to be great at and all those different modalities, right, you kind of have to, it's just a really helpful tool.
Yeah. It actually can help you figure out what data you should be in pursuit of. I think right now that, and I opened yesterday, the Accelerate session yesterday, talking a little bit about, obviously when you're in a startup, as we both are right now, you think about the scarcity of both time and people, right? But actually in this world right now, there's scarcity of everything, right? Natural resources are scarce. We all struggle, large and small companies struggle to retain talented people and to hire new people. Capital's getting more expensive, right? Supply chain issue makes even the things you expect to get, take shipment of and be able to deliver, that's scarce, right? Really operating, no matter what your size, right now in kind of an era of the scarcity of everything. Right? Optimizing it all actually really matters right now.
Yeah, we all thought COVID was coming to an end and now everything could go back to normal. And now we have consumer issues, inflation, global markets, investor jitters, right? I mean, so I think, that's kind of the way the world is, right? I think we've all seen over the last 4 or 5 years that it's always something. And so as a leader, really thinking about nailing what matters most in the organization is so essential, whether it's managing through times of uncertainty, turning your business around, managing acceleration, right? It's these times of complexity, we have to create transparency and trust to move our organization forward and to help people be at their best and collaborate. And so I think there never was, a need, as we were saying, you're exactly right. As a small company, you have to be able to have that open debate. People have to have a way of saying, there's just too much on my plate. I can't get this done. Like, how am I going to prioritize this? Or if this is the thing we need most, then I'm going to do this. And these are the 2 things that I may not be able to get done. And so I really think that, the one aspect we haven't talked as much about is the really large enterprise, because that's the big complexity. Energy dissipates with space, in big companies. And, there's the rumor chains, that come down. And so I actually think in big and large, complex organizations, the bigger they get, the more important it is to be really, really clear on those goals, because people need to see themselves in the whole, how it ladders up. And not because it's like this purpose thing, but because they need to be empowered to see forward, to raise the issues against the most important metrics that matter, and to help reset and move, because they realize, right, if they get slow, they're going to drag all this other stuff down. And I think the biggest risk in large companies is that silos are a killer to speed and agility. And cross-functional alignment, especially horizontally, like 2 to 3 layers down, that is the game changer. When those people at that manager and director level are actually pushing up, they're walking into the meetings. All these issues don't get kicked up to the upstairs. They're walking into the executive meetings saying, hey, we identified this issue, we talked about it, and here's the two options we propose, right? If your organization feels like that, then you're on the right track. If it's the senior guys are looking at the numbers, noticing that things don't work, and then they're sending, right, initiatives down, you are actually not in alignment.
And you're not getting the full brain power and willpower of the talented people you work so hard to hire and bring into the team, right? They're not active participants in that creating
They're
that
not.
future as you describe it. The debate is actually hard, but really worthy. I meet a lot of people who say, well, we couldn't possibly allocate 3 or 4 hours to talk about OKRs. and so you and I both think that's kind of crazy. So, okay, so you'll use the whole quarter for confusion, but you definitely don't want to spend the time to get aligned. But it's an interesting dynamic, right? Like, I don't want to set aside time to have that conversation. Even when people do set aside the time, it's interesting how often there's not a habit of having fruitful debate. There's a sort of a head nod harmony thing that goes on, and you don't really make a set of strategic choices. Like, how have you, just as a leader, in particular, as you're trying to change or bring the culture of the organization forward so it can lean into the future, how have you kind of unlocked the capacity for weighing options, debating them, and then making fruitful decisions?
Yeah, it's interesting. And any of you who work in a big company with a long planning cycle, I truly, truly believe that most of that is not a good use of time. I remember joining Google, and it seemed so odd. Like, we had a full 1 to 2 day annual offsite to get the goals right at the top before anybody did anything else. And I mean, there were like massive debates around what was important, what the priorities would be. And it was so useful, because when you debate and align at the top on the company on what's most important to deliver the strategy and the plan, you see how hard it is for you to get it on one page. Just imagine what happens like underneath you. And, especially in tech, when you're moving so fast, you just don't have a choice, right? Because you just can't do it all. But I think I use this in all the companies, like leadership team offsite, where you actually, that is the way you think about the annual. And then in that meeting, not only do you debate the goals for the company as a whole, right? And you have it can't be more than 5. It has to fit on one page and be explainable in plain English, right? But then each leader, against those critical goals, showing up at that meeting and bringing what are the top things that they're going to contribute against those goals, and what are the 2 or 3 most important things they need from other people in the room to get their work done. And that really proactively surfaces trade-offs at the most executive levels, and you have the important debates that when you don't, in 2 levels down, people are like, really? Like, you set these goals? That's just no way that computes. And then when you finally cascade, you've cleared out the big stuff, but there's still stuff you miss. So when you cascade, you have the same process coming down at these other levels of people saying, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and then cross-checking with their partners across to make sure they didn't miss anything. And when that happens, then a couple things will get surfaced back up that people just say, hey, we can't do all that. But that's your planning. Like, the planning cycle is way faster. It's like 1 month, right? Senior team gets aligned, right? Really debates the tough stuff. There's a couple weeks for everybody else then. And then people can then focus on their plan is in alignment against those goals and everything that everybody signed up to. And that just changes that entire annual planning cycle. And I think, again, to me, that is where the velocity comes from. It's velocity and planning. And then when you're checking against that every quarter to say, am I delivering? Am I gaining momentum? Right? It just changes the whole nature of how people think about strategy, planning, operational execution.
Yeah, clarity actually created the velocity, right?
It does.
Let's talk about, you start the year with a plan, it's well formed, stuff changes, we live in interesting times. Let's talk a little bit about how do you, as a leadership team, how do you help the organization reframe what matters and adjust? Maybe that's a big pivot, or maybe it's just the micro adjustments that keep it on the right arc given new circumstances, either internally or externally, or as it stands now, both internally and externally?
So, I think we talked about this before. I mean, in adopting this, I do think that the biggest headset shift for most people, and this is why it usually takes 3 to 6 months, is that people really have the hardest time shifting from making a list of activities, kind of, I call it the stuff, like, versus like, no, what are the outcomes that will drive the business results and that will actually create velocity? And that discipline, I believe, is the hardest transition in moving to OKRs, because most people are used to listing their activities and then allocating time to them. And I think the pivot that you're talking about really happens when you have that clear North Star metric that aligns to your long-term strategy. So they're saying, take the Ancestry example, net sub growth, not subscriber growth. And the net was very important because it's about like what's left over, right? And active discovery rate is the thing that delivers the most value to subscribers. They want to keep learning new things about their family history, and how actively are they doing it? When that was aligned, then all the innovation, I don't know if any of you feel like you sometimes have an organization where a lot of people have all these ideas and they always say, well, nobody wants to listen to me. They don't want to let me be innovative. But the thing is, when everybody knows that, then the innovation that they're pursuing is against that goal. And so they're trying to move what matters. And so it's much easier to filter relative importance when those things are really clear. And I think that enables a lot more agility. And I think it's that North Star lining down and then enabling innovation to happen against those priorities is really what I think enables that velocity and momentum that you're talking about.
So you use obviously OKRs at Google at high scale and then higher scale.
Yeah.
Then at Ancestry, which it was probably 2,500 people or so, more or less. And now you're CEO of a startup. Do OKRs make sense in a small company?
I mean, to be honest, I had always advised, I'm a big investor and I always advise people to do it, but then, it's when it's yourself, like you have to kind of put your money where your mouth is. So I did start into this new job a few weeks ago and we have 40 people and we're growing like gangbusters. And at first I thought, well, I'm not going to bring, this bureaucracy, to smaller companies. But then after like 2 weeks of meetings, I must admit I have a bias, but I quickly found that what happens is everyone's so busy that what became clear to me is everybody thought they were making progress in their piece and they were super mission driven. But when I talked to the troops, like they weren't really always clear how it all added up. And so I was like, wow, the same issue is right here. And so I like sat down and like 10 days in and I was like, here's the 5 most important questions we're trying to answer, here's what we're trying to get done. And like, how do we make it work? And all of a sudden the team was like, oh, that's so great. And it wasn't that different from what they were doing. But what happened was it forced the debates, right, about the edge case stuff. Because we said, if this is the most important thing we're trying to do now, it enables everybody down the chain to say, oh, well, hang on. If this is the thing I'm really trying to do, I should do more of this. And I think I'm going to let that piece go. So it started enabling people when you have scarce resources to say, I don't need to do that now. I can actually do that later. And it's enabling us like to have everybody kind of feel important. And we're building a big horizontal platform as well as vertical applications. And it's really enabling us to like zero in on like where and how we're trying to create value. So it's just actually been kind of fun to see it actually in person really work.
Yeah, it's small and with a small team. It can be super liberating, I think, for a small team, particularly in the startup where you have way more ambition than you have capacity.
That's it.
And if you've got mission-driven people, right, the idea that you can't do it all can be a little painful. And so just the catharsis of having the conversation, agreeing on what matters in the short run, and having the ability then to set things aside and move them out to later it's like an exhale, right? You can keep from being overwhelmed in the mission itself, right?
Yeah, and I think it's even more subtle than that. Like what I really learned is people are so mission driven and they have these bold ambitions for the future, but they all kind of look a little bit different when you actually boil them down. And so that's what really drove me to sort of say, oh, wait, let's really zero in on the North Star and then the velocity metrics, because what you want to help people see is we're going to get to the golden, the golden goose, but we got to break this thing down in pieces and think about where we're going to get acceleration at each step. And that helps people actually come together versus feel like you're saying what they wanted to do wasn't important. They can see the progression. And that's where I do believe in smaller companies, it actually gets people excited because they're on the boat. They see why sometimes they have to do the earlier stuff and able to get to the longer stuff. And so that's where I've seen it like be very helpful.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask you a last question before we open up to the audience for their questions. What advice would you give to leaders, CEOs and business leaders who don't have a clear intentional framework for both aligning and iterating on the strategic priorities? What would you tell them about why this and why now?
Well, the conversation we had earlier to me is the most important one, but then I'll steal from Jeff Richards after that conversation we had a few weeks ago. But the first piece is your human capital in today's world is the most important asset you have. And your job as a CEO or as an operating leader is to unlock that best of that capital to achieve your objectives. And, without this type of alignment, it's really hard to create that velocity and participative conversation to the future. And especially in a time of volatility, that ability for people to say, these are assumptions, these are the objectives, how do I actually frame these things in the story of the future, I think has never been more important. But I love what Jeff Richards said a few weeks ago when we were all chatting, which is, imagine sales without a CRM or finance without a general ledger, or RevOps, right? Those functions are all data driven. So why is it that we would even consider running the most important thing we do as leaders, which is our strategy, on a piece of paper with no data and alignment, right? So to me, like, it's just, that just really stuck with me as just one of those, like, yeah, like this just makes sense.
Awesome. Yep. We all need a strategy execution stack. That's my mission in particular.
Yeah, it is. I mean,
makes perfect sense to me. And I think ultimately starts to be more and more obvious as we have to shift faster and faster. And our teams now are farther and farther from HQ, right? The reach of the strategy is changed completely. Okay, I'm going to bow out. Doug.
Yes.
Let me bring you back into the mix here, and I will step out, and you can pepper Margo with the questions from the participants.
Well, Margo and Deidre, thank you for that masterclass on the value and importance of strategy, alignment, leadership, and execution. So many great quotes and questions are coming up as well, Margo. So again, thank you for that. Let me share a couple of things that we're seeing from the audience. So one question, oftentimes revenue leaders feel like they might already have the right outcomes and metrics in place, i.e. you spoke about this before, they're using a CRM. But as someone who's led large field organizations, how would you coach a CRO or an SVP of sales on what they would get from OKRs in a digital rhythm?
Yeah, great question. So I do agree that revenue leaders do tend to do this like breathing, because otherwise, right, you're just not going to get to those goals. I do still believe that kind of working backwards concept. So if you're in a high growth business and 3 years from now, right, you got to be 3x that scale, or whatever it is the right target for you. What does that look like? And if you work back, Are you actually setting outcomes and metrics that are achieving the plan you have today, or are you actually setting yourself up for that future? Because if you try to keep figuring that out, and so Google, we're in the extreme case, right? Every quarter we had to shift because the bar just kept going up as we scaled so quickly. But I don't think that's true for any other company. If you wait till that annual plan to figure that out, you're probably going to get it wrong. So I think most revenue leaders think about that cascade to get to this year's plan. I don't think they do enough to think about the future and what are those elements that if I have to keep scaling this need to be different, that are a little bit different metrics than you would just do to accomplish the revenue and the revenue roll up itself. So what's the story of the future and how do you actually see if you're getting there? And then second, is as you think across your different product areas, a big choice revenue leaders often make in a multi-product environment is, right, do I just go at the top line level and then I let people underneath that get there however they get there? How do you think about revenue quality? And how is that quality creating momentum to the future? And so I think that's a really important interrogation as you think about, again, your classic systems don't necessarily push you to care about that.
Right. So the CRM could track how we're doing on the plan, but this notion of revenue quality, that's a decision and a conversation we're going to have, not just about today, but what it means in the future for us.
Right. Revenue quality, fundamental skills momentum. If deal size last year that would help you get to where you needed to was 5 million, but right, in a year and a half to hit your scale targets, it's got to be 50. Well, that's a totally different conversation, right? And so you don't just pivot from that overnight. So you have to think about, well, what is the fundamental capabilities and skills I need? Or what needs to be different? Or do I need to never do $5 million deals anymore? I need to do 50. And how would I actually construct that? And so I think that's a big gap, that's why companies often miss their targets is they were stuck in last year's outcomes and mindsets, but they weren't building enough into the future that was required. And you always need to test that, right, 2 to 3 quarters in advance so that it can then become a scaled new way of doing business.
So a related question to that is, we can see the value of building a learning organization, because if we've got data and we can learn from it, we can iterate faster and faster, but that doesn't mean leaders always are open to building learning organizations. How do you advise and guide there?
Well, I'm not exactly sure how you're using the concept of learning organizations, but I do believe that the data that you look is in the rear view mirror. So the most important thing that a revenue leader in a commercial organization does at the top is you have to be leaning into the future. That data is just keeping score. OKRs should be the things that are actually helping you to accelerate to your long-term goals. And I think not getting confused that those are the same thing is really the purpose that I'm getting at. And that's constantly scrolling forward and checking back, scrolling forward and checking back, and understanding what are those drag factors. And I think maybe that's why, companies like Google, it's not logical that we kept growing over 20% a year and the company's still doing it because they use the same methodology. But it's not an accident. And you keep growing 20 on 20 and 20. Everyone looks at it from the outside and says, oh, they just have this lucky business model. That is not true. We were reorganizing every 3 to 5 months. We were reimagining our way in which we're going to market and retesting new approaches, right? Every quarter. And that was not about looking in those kind of rear view metrics of the sales outcomes. It was looking at those drivers of velocity in terms of our capabilities, in terms of the way we partnered with people, the kind of deal sizes that were coming in, the way we thought about pipelines, right? So all these things, multi-product selling, right? Platform selling and how that was correlated, right? So you had to constantly look at that stuff. And I'm not saying everyone doesn't do that as a traditional revenue leader, but I don't think you're a velocity revenue leader if you don't understand those non-financial metrics.
Were there other than maybe common concerns as you've led organizations of different sizes that may also show up that you had to help them pivot away from so that they could be forward-looking? They could use data to help better drive decisions.
Yeah, I do think at every size and scale of an organization, You have to be relentlessly focused as a leader about, and this is like, I feel like I'm kind of giving motherhood and apple pie commentary, but like the most important choice is what you actually choose people to focus on. And nothing's going to be perfect. And what is primary and what is secondary. And I think that is a skill, right? At different sizes, you know, and I think that's why sometimes executives from really big organizations that look at lots of stuff don't scale well down, because they make things too complex. When you're in the earlier stages, you have to really think about much simpler approaches. And again, those couple of things that say we're getting velocity, but you can't have a whole bunch of stuff. When you get bigger, you have more metrics, but I think you have to think about how you use those strategically versus operationally. To me, you look at them strategically to really understand, again, revenue quality, consistency, right? Gaps and things like that become very important as you get bigger. Where do you have, you know, learning curve problems, or, you know, adoption problems in certain kinds of new ways of doing things? You end up think about things differently at that scale, because you have the ability to compare and contrast and do all that. But even then, you have to choose, like, what is the most important thing to focus? What vertical, what products, what competence, you know, and again, which of those are going to be give you the biggest acceleration? Because the bigger you are, the harder it is to get it done consistently across a large group of people. And so it's not like the choices become any easier. They're just different.
I hear leaders talk about those decisions become existential, because the decision for one thing is a decision for all the other things we're not going to do.
Correct.
And you're standing up, making those choices, those bets to drive the organization.
And you can't get better at everything all at once. And that is the biggest mistake, is like you use all the data as an insight and understanding trends and correlations, but then you still have to just put the stake out there and say, this is the most important thing, and then try to manage, right, the downsides of that.
So you brought a lot of innovation to Ancestry, all for the purpose of helping people align their family trees, right? And now when we talk about bringing the long-term strategy to the objectives, what opportunities do you see there for organizations now to have, like, oh, we can do both of these things and do it in a data-driven way? What excites you about that?
So I just want to make sure I understand the question. Is it the long term and the short term and how they're connected?
Yeah, so as part of the innovation we're bringing to market, maybe this is a little unfair, but as part of that innovation that we're going to bring to market, now there's places for organizations to do both of those things together, drive it in a consistent way in the platform. And if you had both those opportunities to do that in a data-driven way previously, what could that have meant for those organizations, or what do you see the opportunities for how you're leading now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the story I was sharing around, the focus on active discovery rate and net sub growth, and how those two things were correlated, and innovation in small and big ways. How are you gaining material momentum in those metrics, and then seeing how that shows up, right, in the results? And again, those things are totally correlated to revenue, right? So the more discoveries people make, the longer they're the more likely they are to stick around. The more net subscribers you have, obviously that drives revenue. So all these things ladder. But when you're in a tech and an innovation-led organization, right, you need to be able to trade off, like, what's the most important things to move those metrics short, medium, and long term. And that's where frameworks like a 70-20-10 become really helpful, because the 70, and it's a bit of a version of what I was saying on the commercial leaders, right? 70% of your effort should be spent on the things that are going to deliver results in the next 12 months. Like, you have high confidence, if I action these things, it's going to get there. You need 20% that's going to create that next wave of momentum. But that stuff you're pretty confident about. It's like, you know how to do it. You just need to do it in a new area. So you don't need to go reinvent the wheel. And then the 10% is like those things that could change the shape of the curve. But those things better be really great ideas. It's going to take you 3 years to figure it out. And you better be confident, right, when you hit that jackpot, that the juice was worth the squeeze. And I think getting that discipline in organizations around how to set OKRs that span across those timeframes. And I don't think that's just for a tech company. I think that's for any company. As a leader, I think you have to plan to grow. You plan to grow based on the goals you set, based on the way you allocate resource, right? So if you say, I want to do 70, 20, 10, but there's 0.5 in the 10%, well, what do you think the outcome is going to be? 0. Like, you're not going to get any of that stuff, right? So people have to like do those checks, and we would literally do those checks in all the companies I've run to say, well, are we actually putting our money where our mouth is? And is the quality of the things in those buckets really what we think they are? Because in the bucket 3, that 10%, if it's not working and you've tried to, you don't just keep pouring money on it, you regroup and figure out at a principal basis why is it's not working, but you have totally different metrics for something in a 10% versus a 20% versus a 70. A 70 is like, I know what I'm doing, I signed up for this, there's a number assigned against it. But the 20% bucket is stuff that where you're looking at momentum to the ability to execute that, right, over the next 18 months. And then the third one, you're looking for principle-based proof points. And if you don't hit them, you gotta then shut it down and regroup. And I think that's another big mistake people make when they're setting OKRs. They try to set 70 OKRs on the 10%, and then that just chokes off innovation completely.
Well, in your guidance there was a question from the audience. Would you mind sharing the general nature of your top 5 questions when you're driving your businesses? Is there a general way to sum that up without getting too specific?
Yeah, I think, let me try. It depends on the situation, but I think if I had to boil it down, I would say I'm relentlessly focused on like, what is that North Star metric? Like, what is the most important thing that we are trying to do for the world? And it might be 1 or 2 things, but absolute clarity on what does that really look like? And then what are the principle-based drivers that would enable you to accomplish that? Like, what do I have to be really good at? And within that, like, what are the velocity drivers that would tell you? So I'm all about velocity to the goal. And like, how do you think about what it is you're doing and what would help you gain acceleration against that, so that you're constantly looking for ways to speed up? And then I'm looking at, okay, how is my organization aligned to achieve that, right? Is the way I'm structured actually leading into that future? Because sometimes the way things have been organized in the past don't reflect what you're actually trying to accomplish. And so half your problem is that you just don't have people focus on achieving that velocity, right? It's like, who's owning achieving that velocity? And then the last piece, is really the skills and capabilities, right? Is assessing if I'm trying to be great at that and accomplish that momentum, where are my blind spots? Like, where do we actually need to learn from somebody else, or where do we need to borrow insights to accelerate, or new skills or new perspectives, because it's not the way we've always done it. And so unless we inject, some really smart thinking into that, we're not going to actually change our mind. Because people who've only done one pattern, like, who's going to be that disruptor? Who's going to be the challenger that's going to spark the imagination and ask that contrarian question? And I think that's probably the way I think about it.
Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that. And like, people are like blowing up the chat on that. So that was really helpful and valuable. And then I think we have time for one more question. Look, there are people throughout the organization that aren't performing, they're struggling. How do you organize and help those parts of the organization to sort of elevate them up to get to that speed and velocity that you're after?
Yeah, so this goes back to something Deidre said earlier. Are we using our metrics to keep score on people, or are we using it to figure out where we have challenge in the organization and where we need to support people? So I'm a leader, I'm a servant leader mindset, and I believe that everybody has the ability to be an A. But what is happening around them in terms of the goals, the resources, the alignment, right, that's slowing them down? Because if you're a great leader, you're trying to lead heads up versus heads down. And so how am I pulling these people into the future? So I think where you have organizations that are slowing down, you've got to do that detective work to figure out what is it that's in their way. I think I'll never forget when I was at Ancestry, I had this amazing payments team. And these guys were so smart, and they had all these great insights about what we needed to do to make it better for the consumers. And, you know, we signed up for a bunch of OKRs, and they were so ambitious that they ran like hell, but then all these things started breaking. And I was like, wait, these guys are this team is so good. Like, there's no way like that they could have, like, this could have gone that wrong unless there's something wrong here. So I remember I like said, wait, let's stop the madness. And like, we went into a conference room, and I was like, we're just gonna take out a whiteboard, and I don't care about any of these things that just happened. All I want to do is talk about, you guys are way so smarter than this. Like, what happened? And then it all came flooding out, you know, all the issues that were there and like these constraints that they had, and they just didn't feel comfortable surfacing them. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, we should have just slowed down development and fixed all these things and said, okay, we're just going to fix it now. It doesn't matter that we made this mistake. Let's fail forward fast. And we put in place a bunch of changes. And then all of a sudden, like 6 months later, they were like running like crazy. And I just think sometimes as leaders, we don't take the time to really, really, really listen to what's slowing people down, and then figure out how we are going to put them on the path to velocity going forward. And there's just nothing more empowering for a team. And then I was like, and also promise me that if you ever have concerns like this again, you're going to like jump up and down and raise your hand until somebody listens to you, because you have an obligation to dissent, right? But I think a lot of times leaders don't let people tell them the truth, right?
Well, thank you for opening that space for people in your organization at all levels, because that's when I keep hearing about diversity and inclusion, like, people want to know that they're contributing. They want to be able to have a voice in that.
Yeah.
And you're opening the space for that. And I think a lot of organizations are trying to make that same intention. So thank you for offering that and being that in your organizations. It's really, it's energetic, it's inspiring. It's why people want to come work with you.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here, and such an important topic. It's not about the software. It's about, you know, our OKRs and of themselves. It's about a different way of thinking about leadership. It's about leadership that's really aligned and focused on setting priorities. It's about empowering the organization from the bottom up to be part of the conversation and to take ownership and do what they all want to do to get to the future. And it's like riding a bike, right? you kind of feel a little wobbly at first, but like once you start like getting used to this, you just can't go back, right? Because it's so much more fun to be at work when you kind of see all the pieces fitting together.
For sure. Margo, again, thank you for this conversation. And as I said before, this masterclass, we are the wisdom that you shared, the quotes, the work that you took to get here. Thank you for sharing that and imparting it with everyone. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.